Hey BookTube! So it's the end of the year, and I want to join the chorus of videos that make their best and worst reads of the year. So this will be my kind of mixture up video, mixing my best and worst reads of the year. And I'll apologize beforehand because I don't have a lot of the physical books with me. So I only have a small stack of physical books to show you. That's because of either one, I don't have the physical books with me right now. They're in my other place where I film, where I have most of my books that I just leave there, um, and or most of them are on my e-reader, and then I would have to spend a lot of time tapping around on my e-reader just to show you a digital cover, and I don't really think that's totally worth it. And I also don't really have the power to impose those titles, those digital book cover titles that a lot of people know how to do with lots of editing skills, which I don't have. So it'll just have to be me rambling and showing up a few books here and there. And if I get through my best and worst books of the year, if I get through that fairly quickly, then I'll launch into a bunch of questions that I've been answering by myself, really, after each reading year, and I kind of laid them out into almost a tag, similar to what some other people have been doing, some end of the year tag, but these are questions that I've taken from a friend who's not on BookTube and who I've kind of adapted for my own purposes, and they're a little bit more specific, breaking down my reading years. So if not, I'll make that a separate video if this gets too long, which I hope it doesn't, but so I'll start off with my most disappointing, because I've separated as I have 5 books as the most disappointing reads of the year, so 5 books of that are I found the most disappointing, and then 1 book for the worst reads of the year, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get into, and then 10 books as the top 10, which I did rank from 10 to number 1. So we'll get on to the most disappointing reads of the year. We'll start off with number 5. Actually, I should have looked up the author for this, but I don't. Yeah, I should have looked up the author. This is the one book that I didn't look up the author for when I was looking up authors for this video. Anyways, it's This Beauty. I think the author is like Nick Regal or something like that, and it's a short, like 100-page philosophy book, nonfiction, and I read it on my e-reader, and it's just a book praising the beauty of life and the beauty of living, and I thought that it'd be full of like good prose and some interesting insights and thinking, because not everyone has a 100-page book on just a general topic such as the beauty of life, and so I thought it'd be a quick, meaningful read, and I thought I would get a lot of insight from it, and I was very disappointed with it because the whole premise of the book and what he did is taking a whole bunch of like very popular slogans like live life to your fullest, that kind of thing. There's a few more that he goes into that I can't remember off the top of my head, but like slogans like that, live life to the fullest, live your best life now, that kind of thing, and breaks down their superficiality, but then also breaks down potential lasting impacts of meaning that you can actually glean from these well-worn slogans, and you can actually find comfort in them. And so I found that for every interesting insight that he did have, he had maybe 5 or 6 that were completely laughable and quite annoying and far-fetched. So, and that's quite impressive for a 100-page book. So I wouldn't recommend it, though, and I don't think his insights were specifically groundbreaking either. And one of the main things that really did aggravate me about this book is that he always talks about the life in the terms of consent. Like, we didn't consent to live in this world, we didn't consent to exist, we just kind of came into this world and we had to cope with it, and we didn't consent. And this talk about consent in the terms of life I find completely nonsensical, because life just is. We don't and talk about it in modern terms such as consent, like we gotta consent to everything, gotta consent to and consent is a very popular term and used in a whole bunch of different areas nowadays. So I understand why, because it's a very contemporary discussion which he's involved in. But consent in the terms of existing in life, we don't consent to having life, don't consent to being asked to live, just seems so nonsensical to me, because it's just a non-starter in the terms of of the discussion. Like, how can you even consent to life, or if theoretically you could, or like how that even work? And the only way you can think of that is if you have some immortal soul that you consent to in some heavenly realm, and I find that nonsensical too. So the idea of consent there is just a non-starter for me in that terms. But anyways, that's just a specific part of that book that aggravated me. Number 4 is Breaking Bread with the Dead. I think that's by Alan Jacob, or is it Alan Jacob? It's an Alan somebody. I think it's Alan Jacob, or Alan Jacobs. Breaking Bread with the Dead has a very interesting premise. It's also a nonfiction book, and it's also 120 pages. It's a nonfiction book about reading and rereading old books and authors of these books. And Breaking Bread with the Dead is his glorification of this process in this age of distraction. And he Alan Jacobs is a professor, a philosophy professor or some religious professor or something, and I was hoping for a lot of insight and depth into this book, but mostly it seemed like just the author, he was being self-indulgent, which is impressive to do in a 100-page book, but he was also not nearly as insightful as he wanted to be. Like, he was pulling quotes from just anywhere to try and create a tapestry of meaning, and I didn't think that worked at all. Like, I found like at least for me, a lot of the quotes didn't seem to connect with his main ideas, or he was indulging in his own knowledge and showing that off to the reader too much, even though if that's well done, I don't take offense to that. I know some people would, but I usually don't. But I don't know, it just seemed like a lot of quotes for quotes' sake is how I would put it. And so when you start overquoting books, usually, especially with quotes that can be so personal in nature, where when you quote them, you find the specific meaning in them that relates to your point, which maybe everyone else who reads that same quote doesn't see that or doesn't get what you're referring to, and yet the author thinks that the less said, the more profound the impact is. And that can be done well, as we'll see later on in this list, but I didn't think this book did it for me. So that's number 4. Number 3 is a reread, and it's the first fiction book that I'll be discussing. It's The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, and I've read this book a couple times already, but I read it from front to back in a short succession, which is the first time I've ever done that. And Ray Bradbury is a favorite author, and I used to love this book. The Illustrated Man was one of the books I read in high school, which was a transforming book for me in the sense of the ideas that he explores in these short stories, because The Illustrated Man is a book of short stories, science fiction short stories, and specifically in this book he takes a bunch of short stories and superimposes a story onto them, where it's the story of this man who gets all these tattoos on his body, and they're like magical tattoos where they move during the night, and they all tell the future in some way, in some mystical way. And he can't get them off anymore, and he's trapped with these short stories. And then there's the one section on his shoulder that is blank, and that every time he meets with someone and he's with them for long enough, that blank spot will basically turn into give the future to the person he's with, so that person will, and how that person will die. And it's very bleak, because this book came out in the 50s, but I found the short stories so stimulating when I was in high school, but really reading them now, I found that a lot of them didn't stick with me at all anymore. They just seemed they trudge out their point. I mean, he has his rhetorical flourishes, A lot of some short stories are stronger than others, of course, with every short story collection, but they didn't have that same alive quality as they once did to me, and it felt kind of flat. And a lot of them seemed kind of dated too, because of course in the early 50s when this book came out, a lot of the concern was with the Cold War, and so a lot of these short stories not just deal with the Cold War, but also with some with race relations, which are interesting in their own way. But I found that it was a lot more dated and a lot less lively than I thought. So maybe it's a good thing that I encountered this and loved it when I was in high school, because I can have that memory still of loving them, and I still fondly remember some of these short stories in the sense that I like their premise, but the execution just kind of left me flat. So that's where I'm at with number 3. Now we get to number 2, which we actually get my first prompt. Number 2 is a book I just recently read. I finished, I think, in November or early December, and that's Devils by Dostoevsky. This is his book Devils. This is the Michael Kratz translation in this old Oxford paperback. And this is number 2 for the most disappointing reads for me, because I read this after reading another book of his that will show up later on my best reads list, and I was off the high of reading. I was coming off the high of reading that book, and I was just so energetic and excited to read more Dostoevsky. This is a book that I've had on my shelves for a while now, and I've been wanting to read it, and usually the length has been a little bit off-putting to me. Not usually because length is off-putting, but because I know Dostoevsky takes, his length is deceptive. It usually takes more time to digest, and but then I picked it up finally this year in November, and I didn't gel with the story at all. I didn't gel with the plot at all. I mean, I understand Dostoevsky, and I know the themes of this book, and I know that I would get a lot more from rereading this book, but the first impressionable read of this did not stick with me at all. I did not like I didn't understand a lot of what he was trying to go for, even though I saw flashes of it along the way. I'll put it that way. So I got him, but I didn't, if that makes any sense. And I was, for most of the book, I was waiting for this revelation of, like, what's the point of all this, and is it going to come, and as it does for the other book that I'll be mentioning, but it never did come. And anyways, this book is about the revolution, about a bunch of rowdy revolutionaries in this not smaller town, but more of a rural Russian community. And it's told by a first-person perspective, and it's mostly about the clash of the old religious landed gentry and compared to the old intellectuals and their kind of moderate liberal ideas, and then we have this radical new generation that kind of comes in and sweeps everything aside and causes chaos. And Dostoevsky is a very religious writer, and so a lot of that plays into, traditional religious norms as well. A lot of the characters are nihilistic, but then a lot of characters in here are some of them are former nihilists who've turned religious and have there's a lot of searching for meaning in here, but I didn't find it. I found some of it interesting, and I hope I'll find it more interesting when I reread this someday. But as a first read, it did not sit well with me, mostly because I just didn't understand a lot of the motivations, and especially the relationship between one of the main intellectuals in this book, who stands for like the old liberal way of things, because he's like on that bridge between traditionalism and radicalism, and it's how we start off. The very first chapter is called "By way of introduction, some details from the biography of the highly esteemed Stefan Tremovich Verkhonovsky," and um, I found a large section of that dull because I didn't, and for the rest of the book, I didn't understand what the point of him as a character is and why our main character was so close to him. I mean, not so much as the main character as in the sense that he's the focal point of the story. He's the one telling the story, but in the sense of I didn't get half of what his purpose was, because the the novel veers off in its perspective midway through this book, where all of a sudden our we have our narrator discussing motivations and thoughts and conversations that he had no way of knowing, and yet he's still relating this as if he's writing this down for an audience, in some kind of journalistic inquiry, and so it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And even the ending left me a lot quite dry, even though or just bland. So it was boring, and I didn't understand a whole lot of it. So that's Devils by Dostoevsky. And then number one is a book that I don't have here. It's The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And the reason why it was the most disappointing is not because it was the worst, or because it was boring, or because I didn't, or because it's worse than any of these books that I had on this list, is because I had the most highest expectations for this book, and then it didn't come near approaching those high expectations. Number one, because if you watch Steve Donahue, he largely claims this book as the best book of the 21st century, or the 20th century, excuse me, and so I had high expectations for that because I've read some really good 20th century novels, and two, because I've largely enjoyed Mann in the past. I don't know if I've let it known on this channel, but I've loved Thomas Mann's shorter work, his short stories, Death in Venice. He's got a short story, Tristan, which I highly suggest everyone goes and checks out. It's a great short story, even though it's sort of tragic, or well, it is tragic, but tragic in an almost callous sort of way. But anyways, and then I've loved his short stories. I read that vintage paperback that I don't have right now to wave in front of the camera. But I've loved his short stories, and then I've read a previous novel of his, Dr. Faustus, which I really struggled to read. But looking back, I look back at it fairly fondly, and I think I would get a lot more out of it from a reread, which I'm sure is going to be the case for The Magic Mountain. But I was expecting it to blow me away somehow, and it didn't do that. It's a novel that just kind of sits there, and not a whole lot seems to happen. And I'm okay with that. I've loved books that have done that. I mean, I've read Proust all the way through, and he's largely like that. But the thing with Proust is that he's got magic and sparkle in his characters and in his social insights that are very satirical and biting, and he's got a lot of beautiful language to back that up. And I didn't find that in Magic Mountain. I found it was well written. It's very intelligently done, and I respected it for that. But I didn't get it, and it's same with the Devils. I just didn't get it, and I was constantly waiting for that turn to be something in me to switch. Like, I finally get what he's going for. And the thing is, I wasn't even turned off by the most notorious parts of this book, where there's a lot of intellectual back and forth between these two characters that are trying to influence our main character, Hans Castorp. It's the story, the Magic Mountain, I guess I should say, is the story of Hans Castorp going to the sanatorium in the mountains to visit his cousin who's sick with tuberculosis. And first he goes there to visit for a few weeks, and then he ends up getting sick himself, and then stays there for 7 years. And the whole story is like this coming of age story. But I've read some subsequent material that argues very convincingly, I think, that this is like an anti-coming of age story, because usually a coming of age story is like this character gets disillusioned, gets about this innocent view of the world that they had, and they have to grow up through this and find like the hard rock of real world experience and how everything's not as it should be, and they just have to kind of live with that and mature around that the biting fact of the pain and suffering of life. But this book was more like Hans Castorp indulging in the pleasures and kind of the idleness of life and coming of age through thinking and debating intellectual ideas or being influenced by intellectual ideas, and kind of verging between, say, uh, a rationalism exposed by NAFTA, one of the main characters in the book, or like the radicalist rationalism that he has, and then kind of like this empiricism, this liberalism of Settembrini, the Italian intellectual in the book, and then these ideas kind of clash, and they're part of the main thrust of the book. And I really enjoyed their very dense intellectual discussions uh, on philosophical subjects, so that wasn't a problem. It was more of the long uh, spirit of time that we spend in this book, where it's just a lot of idleness, a lot of reflecting. Some things I just didn't quite get and didn't quite understand. Like, spoiler alert, I'm going to be spoiling something of this novel. And near the end of the story, there's this grand scene where they're after we've spent pages and pages of Hans Castor being converted over to science. He's, the man of science. Science fascinates him, biology specifically, and he's very. And so it's like, and it's reflecting. Of course, it's supposed to be reflecting the ideas that were in the air before the First World War. About scientific progress and about rational thinking and the role of reason and humans conquering the world and through reason and conquering nature and subduing through their heightened awareness of science and the scientific method. But then he mixes Thomas Mann mixes this up with this very strange moment near the end of the book where he goes to a seance or seance or however you pronounce that, where the point is to commune with the dead and ask questions with the dead. So that's what they do, and there's a whole group that's been doing this for a while, but then finally Hans Castor breaks in and he joins them, and they ask, and so they're talking with this ghost, and the ghost makes a request for them, like, what if I could bring someone back from the dead that you could see, who would it be? And no one really wants to answer. They're all kind of afraid. Like, who would they bring back from the dead? And Hans Castor breaks in and he says his friend, or his cousin, and because his cousin, who was the main reason why he went there in the first place, ends up dying later on in the novel, which is why I'm saying this is a spoiler. And so then we get this harrowing scene where they wait for this really long time, like, is this going to happen? And all of a sudden this ghost does appear, and he just kind of, like, he sits there off to the side, and the thing is, he's not even dressed up as he used to when everyone knew him. He's dressed up in his military garb, which is kind of the reason why he ended up dying. And Hans Castorp he's so jarred by this that he gets up, turns on the light, and storms out. Like, he can't even handle this. And it's like this, and I don't understand why that was there. I know there's a lot of meaning to this, and I know that man is trying to explore something with that, but I didn't get it. And so I find that this novel must have been beyond me in some way, but I still find it hard to call this the best novel of the 20th century when you've got such delightful novels like Mrs. Dalloway, where I can just go back and sink into that book and reread sections of it and just be in awe of the breathless, frantic brilliance that Virginia Woolf creates in that very short novel. But anyways, that's aside. That's my top 5 most disappointing reads. We got number 1, Magic Mountain. Number 2, Devils by Dostoevsky. Number 3, The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. Number 4, Breaking Bread with the Dead. I think it's Alan Jacob. And then number 5, This Beauty. And then I'm going to end this off. I think I'm going to end this off just with my worst read, and then I'll do a separate video for my best reads, and then I'll do a separate video for kind of my end of the year wrap up tag questionnaire. Number 5, no, my worst read of the year. I usually do like a top 5 list of my 5 worst reads, but I'll explain why I didn't do that this year. My worst read of the year was The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, and I didn't even bother to look up the author because it's an extremely famous book. Most people have read it. It's very short. It's usually given to kids to read in school or something like that, and it's very famous. It was made into a movie, but to me it plays around with history too much, and I did not like that at all. And I found it a very manipulative historical look at what I was trying to give. And I guess I should give an example or sketch out what the book is about. It's about this boy who grows up in Nazi Germany, and his father is becomes basically the chancellor or the leader of, or the top man in charge of a concentration camp. And like his father is a German and he's German, but the boy himself is like woefully ignorant of Nazi Germany during the time, and he is when they move there into that to be right beside the concentration camp, he's always confused why there's all these people in these pajamas behind this fence, and he's always told he can't go near them or talk with them or anything like that. But he ends up making friends with a boy further away by the fence, and it's the boy in the striped pajamas, and they become friends because they're the same age, and they just kind of meet up every single day afternoon and just talk. And I found it very manipulative, one, because of the ending, which I won't spoil, because I'm sure if you've read this book, you'll know the ending. The ending, of course, is very unrealistic, because that's just not how things happened during that. I mean, I've read autobiographies of people in concentration camps, and that's just not how concentration camps worked. So I knew that the ending is very manipulative because it's made to be very emotional, but it's not at all realistic. And 2, the ignorance of the main character was infuriating, because that's not historically accurate at all. A boy who's the son of a hugely influential Nazi figure is not going to be as ignorant as he was, and like this innocent bystander. He was written as as a 21st century person encountering Nazi Germany for the first time, and I found that completely destroyed any use of the book as anything other than kind of modern propaganda. And I say that hesitantly because, of course, like what Hitler and the Nazis did was absolutely horrible, but to manipulate history in this way by presenting this completely unrealistic figure doing completely unrealistic things is very unhelpful in our kind of rewriting of history through our own lenses. So anyways, that's my tirade for that book. And then the reason why I only have one is because if I put down the worst reads I had technically based on reading experience, all of it would be Aristotle. The rest would be Aristotle. I read 3 books by Aristotle this year, and I didn't understand a single one of them, and they are all very difficult. They took me a long time to read, and but the thing is, I knew what I was getting into, and I kind of got a sick joy out of struggling with Aristotle, even though it took me a while, and I can't say that I got a whole lot that I understood from reading Aristotle, but just the fact of pushing through reading Aristotle, not speed reading through him, but actually like trying to carefully consider what he's writing, even though I don't have any secondary material and I didn't search up any secondary material, but just to read Aristotle in translation, I found that very dense, very frustrating, and I would have put them here, but I don't consider those as worst reading experiences, even though they were technically fairly bad in the sense that uh, they were they were boring and I didn't comprehend very much from them. Um, so I wouldn't consider them worst reads. So I only have The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas because nothing else really stuck out as something that I would consider a worst read. So, anyways, that's it for this video. I'll stop here while I'm ahead. I'm at 30 minutes, and then I'm gonna go on right away into my best books, and then I'll do that tag. So, we'll see you in the next video.